welcome to Alamanda Textiles. In this tutorial I'll be showing you how to make a reversible bucket hat. You will need the following materials and equipment: 1 fat quarter of fabric, some contrasting fabric for the lining, some medium weight iron-on interfacing, your pattern pieces, paper scissors, fabric scissors and pins. To get started, you're going to use your paper scissors to cut out all your pattern pieces. Now this pattern, which comes from the Essentials Club, comes in 2 sizes. For my head, which is 58 centimeters, I have chosen the larger size. If you need help with sizing, please come and see me. But cut out all your pattern pieces so they are ready to place on your fabric. Next up, you're going to get your fabric ready. So I have chosen a purple fabric for the lining for my bucket hat. And what I'm doing is I'm opening out my fat quarter, placing it on top of the lining, which is doubled over, it's folded in half, cutting off a piece, and then cutting that lining piece in half along that fold. Fold up your second piece of fabric, and you can pop that back in the fat quarter drawer for other people to use. Next up, I'm taking my medium weight interfacing. I'm placing my lining on top of that and cutting out the interfacing so it is exactly the same size as the lining. So just trimming off those edges. Then I place my fat quarter on top, and now our fat quarter is a little bit bigger than a regular fat quarter, so I'm trimming that down as well. So all 3 pieces of interfacing, lining and fat quarter are exactly the same. Right, next up you're placing your pattern pieces onto your 3 layers of fabric and interfacing. Be careful with the direction of your pattern here, because you need to make sure that if your fabric has a direction like these rainbows do, they need to not be upside down. So take care with that as you place your pattern pieces onto your fabric, and this is the direction that they should be in. So you will note that the curves are going up. The bottom of the curves are at the bottom of the pattern direction. Once you've checked that your patterns are in the right direction, it is time to cut out your fabric. So just double check that all 3 layers are pinned together. Then take your fabric scissors and carefully cut around your pattern pieces. The next step is to remove all those pins, and please keep hold of your pattern because we will use it for future projects. Now I'm separating the layers, and that interfacing layer, you will notice one side is shiny and the other side is dull. That shiny side has glue on it, and when we iron that, the glue will melt and stick to the wrong side of our fat quarter fabric. So when you're separating these layers, you need to make sure that that shiny side is face down on the wrong side of your printed fabric. Right, once you've got your fabric ready, we're going to the linen press. You need to turn the linen press on, make sure it's at the highest setting for ironing on your interfacing, and you're going to very carefully, because this is very hot, double check that your shiny side of your interfacing is face down on the wrong side of your fat quarter. Then you're going to put a piece of calico on top to protect the interfacing and the linen press. Bring the lid down with 2 hands, close it until you hear the beep. While you're waiting for the beep, it's important to keep both hands on the linen press and concentrate on what you are doing so you don't burn your fabrics. Once you've heard that beep, you need to then lift up the linen press lid, remove the calico, and carefully remove your fabric that has the interfacing on. Put it on a flat surface because you do not want that to cool down over bumps, because it can put the shape of the bump into your fabric. Alright, now we just repeat that process with the other 4 pieces of your hat, making sure that you hold down the lid, use the calico for protection, and wait for the beep on each piece. Alright, so I've got my 4 pieces of fat quarters for my hat, which have all been interfaced. When you're finished with the linen press, make sure you turn it back off, please. Okay, so now we've got our fabrics interfaced. You are now ready for sewing. You're essentially going to be making this hat twice, one in your patterned fabric for the outside and one in your lined fabric for the inside, and then we sew the 2 together. So I'm lining up my hat pieces with my fat quarter fabric and pinning those sides together as so. And then I repeat that with the brim. So the brim is the larger part of this bucket hat. The smaller part is the part that goes around your head, and the brim is the part that sticks out, protecting your ears and neck. Repeat that with your lining as well, so pinning your brim together and the main part of your hat. So there's our 4 pieces ready for sewing. Next up we go to the sewing machine, and you'll be using a seam allowance of about 1 centimetre for this project. So lining up with that 10 line on the sewing machine. And when you're sewing your seams, remembering to use the reverse button for back stitching to ensure that your stitches are locked in place and don't fall apart. That is really, really important. Also remembering to take your pins out as you sew. Please do not sew over the top of your pins. That is really dangerous as it can break the pin and the needle. So now moving on to my outside of my hat, sewing those 2 edges on the brim, and again the main part of the hat. Alright, so now we are up to putting the hat together. So we're going to start with the main part of the hat that goes around your head, and if you turn it around, you can see that the seams on the outside should look nice and neat, and we need to line those up with the top part of the hat. So you'll need to put the main part of your hat back in reverse, inside out. And to line up the seams with the top part of my hat, what I do is I fold the hat in half and just mark those halfway marks with a pin. So just putting a pin where that halfway mark is on both sides. Then open that out, and those 2 pin marks are going to line up with your 2 seams on the side of your hat. So open out that seam. This is an open seam, and you're going to line up that first pin with the center of that seam with your open seam allowance, one side on each side of that mark. Do the same on the other side. Now this can get a bit difficult to work with because the interfacing is making the fabric stiff. It's not easy necessarily to work with interface fabric, especially with the medium and heavyweight interfacing. So now what you're going to be doing is working your way around the outside of that the hat, lining up the edges and spreading the fabric around so they meet up with each other. Now this can be really, really tricky. If you get halfway around and you've got a little bit of leftover, you need to go back and distribute that extra fabric around the entire circumference of the hat. Don't just leave a lump because you'll end up with a pucker on the outside of your fabric, which we do not want. We are now going to be repeating that process with the lining. Much easier to do it with the lining, so you might want to do that first because the lining fabric is not interfaced. It's much easier to work with. So now the top part of your hat and the outside should look like this. Alright, back to the sewing machine. Now I do recommend that you sew the lining first. Sewing around in a circle like this is very tricky. It'll be better if little mistakes are made with your lining. This is a reversible hat, so you should be able to wear it the other way around. But if you are going to make some mistakes with this, do it in your lining first. It's also easier to sew the lining because it is not interfaced, so you'll find that the sewing around in the circle with the interfacing is even trickier than the lining. So again, using a seam allowance of about 1 centimetre, we are going around very carefully. I am taking the pins out as I go. You'll notice I've put a lot of pins in this. That is to hold your fabrics together nicely as you go around. This is very fiddly. Please take your time with this and make sure that you do not have any little lumps or bumps in your fabric, because they will be sewn in and they will look like little puckers on the outside when you turn it around. So carefully going around. This is in fast forward and it's still quite slow. So please make note of that. Take your time with doing this. It is quite tricky. Alright, so that is my lining done. So you can flip that around the right way and have a look to see how you went. Not a bad job. And then we move over to the outside. So again, as I said, this is interface, so it is quite tricky. This is sped up, but just as I did with the lining, please take your time going around this circle. Going around like this can be very tricky, and you want the outside of your hat to look as neat as possible. So flipping that around the right way. It is now time to attach the brim. So again, right sides together, and we are attaching the small curve of the brim to the bottom of the hat, not the large curve. The large curve is what sticks out and protects your ears. And I am opening up the seam of my brim as well, so just pressing those open with my finger and lining up the seam of the brim to the seam of the main part of the hat. So on the other side, opening out that seam and lining up those two seams. So always start by lining up those two seams, and then you can start pinning in the round. When you pin in the round, you need to make sure that the edges of your fabric are completely lined up. And take your time to make sure that the pins are holding the edges together and that your fabric is evenly distributed all the way around your hat. So there's no little gathers that are going to get sewn in and cause a pucker on the outside. So there's the hat part. We repeat this with the lining. So pinning all the way around, starting with the two seams and making sure you open out those seams and get ready for sewing. Now when we get to the sewing machine, you take the flatbed attachment off, and we're going to put the sewing machine inside the hat and taking those pins out as we go. So this part isn't quite as tricky as the previous step of sewing the top to the headband. Sewing the brim to the headband is much easier because it's not as tight, and you can also put the sewing machine inside the hat, which makes it a little easier as well. But again, using a seam allowance of 1 centimetre, you're going to go around the brim and the headband, sewing those two pieces together, removing the pins as you go, and being careful when you do get to those seams that when you sew over those seams that you are sewing those seams open. So one part of the seam allowance goes either side of the seam. This will just help it look nicer, sit better on the outside of your hat when you're wearing it. Alright, so that is the lining done. Starting to look a little bit more like a hat now. And we're going to head to the outside of the hat, the main part, repeating the same process, going all the way around, using a seam allowance of 1 centimetre and taking those pins out as we go. Alright, now you have essentially made two hats. One is the lining and the other is the outside. You're going to put the outside of the hat the right way around and your lining the wrong way around, so our right sides are together. So your lining fabric doesn't have a clear right and wrong side, but once you have sewn it, it becomes clear because the nice side of the seam is now the right side. So you are lining up the nice sides of the seams of both hats, the lining and the outside together, so you can see the wrong side, the stitching, on the outside of both of these as we sew, remembering that we sew inside out, right sides together. So pin your two hats together all the way around the brim, making sure to evenly distribute your fabric and that the edges are lined up neatly. Now, when you sew your hat together, you do need to leave a gap. This is so you can flip it. So make sure that you leave a gap of about 10 centimeters so there's enough room to flip it. So when I start sewing it together, I'm going to start at these two pins and I'll sew all the way around until I reach the next two pins. So back to the sewing machine, I'm starting at those two pins and I'm removing them and reverse stitching. That's really important, so when you flip it, the stitches don't just pop open. And just slowly make your way around the brim of the hat, making sure that those seam allowances stay open. We are doing open seams in this project. And I'm just slowly making my way around using a centimetre seam allowance, taking those pins out as I go. Now when I reach the final two pins where I marked my opening, I am reverse stitching, and then I can use that gap to flip my hat around the right way. So turning that around now, so you need to put the entire hat through on itself until you can see the right sides of both the outside of the hat and the lining. Once you have flipped it, you need to then press with your fingers the brim of the hat so the seam allowance is nice and flat. I'm going to be using pins to ensure that that seam is sitting nicely for top stitching, which is the next step of the hat. So pinning all the way around, and when you do get to the gap, you'll need to make sure that the two little edges are tucked inside neatly. Alright, so once you have made it all the way around your hat with pinning, we then take it back to the sewing machine and you are going to top stitch 3 millimeters away from the edge of the hat, remembering to reverse stitch as you go around here and take the pins out as you go. Now as you do this, you need to ensure that the hat fabric is flat in the lining as well, and you're not catching the lining underneath that you can't see. I'm doing that with my left hand just by feeling that it feels flat as I'm sewing, but feel free to look underneath the hat and make sure that that lining is flat and you're not catching it up. So all the way around the brim and reverse stitching, trim your threads off as you go, and that is our first stitch around the brim, and we're going to do several more of these. So the next thing that we need to do is pin around where the headband of the hat meets the brim, making sure that it is neat on the outside and the inside. So keep checking inside your hat. Make sure that the fabric is flat, both on the outside, which is really easy because of the interfacing, but also on the lining, because you want the inside of your hat to look just as neat as the outside, because this is a reversible hat. Okay, so back to the sewing machine. You can take your flatbed attachment off again. You can have it off the whole project if you want. And you are now going to go around the brim of the hat several times with top stitching. Now it's up to you how far apart you have your top stitch. I've chosen to use the edge of my presser foot as a guide, so I'm lining up my previous top stitch with the edge of my presser foot. That makes your top stitching quite close together. You might choose to use a different guide for going around your top stitching, but whatever you choose, whatever measurement you choose, you need to be consistent so the brim of the hat looks nice and even as you go around. Now this part of the process takes a lot of time. Now you might have noticed when I started this top stitch, I did not reverse at the beginning. When I reach the end, I'm going to reverse over the start of the top stitch. This just makes the outside look a little bit neater. So when I start my next top stitch run, you will notice that I do not reverse when I start. I'm lining up the fabric and I just start sewing straight and going all the way around and then reversing over the start when I go to the end. So here we are going around many times. Alright, so now I've gone around the brim of my hat many times. The last step is to stitch in the ditch to hold the final bit of the brim to the lining. Now to stitch in the ditch, what this means is to open up your seam, so press it open with your fingers, and make sure that the needle is going to sew in that ditch where that previous seam was, from the headband to the brim. Take your time with this. It's really easy to accidentally get your lining fabric caught up underneath where you can't see it. So do keep checking underneath as you go and making sure that your lining fabric is not getting caught up as you stitch over the top. If it does get caught up, you will need to unpick it and re-sew this stitch in the ditch part. And that's because if the lining does get caught up, the inside of your hat's going to be a bit smaller for your head and it's not going to sit properly on your head. So getting this right is really important. All right, trimming off those threads, and that is it. That is the whole process. We have now made our bucket hat and it is ready for trying on, and the inside should look just as good as the outside. Congratulations!